My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I do appreciate you being with me so very, very much. We're looking at the fact that Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15:56 that sin was the sting of death. The axiom, if you deal therefore with sin, you've dealt with death. This is so critical to understand. And we're looking at Romans chapters 5 through 8, which are directly parallel with 1 Corinthians 15. Both of those texts deal with Adam, sin, and death. They deal with Christ, resurrection, and life. And so, if we can define clearly, undeniably, what death Paul is talking about in Romans 5 through 8, that means that's what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, unless somebody can prove otherwise. I mean, after all, in Romans 5 to 8, you have Adam, sin, and death. You have Christ, righteousness, and life. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, you have Adam, sin, and death. You have Christ, resurrection, and life. How much more parallel could it be? Okay, I want you to notice that when we look closely at Romans chapter 5, as we continue our discussion of chapter 5, and I hope you understand I'm being brief in these presentations, because an exegesis of Romans 5 through 8 could take a year all by itself. This is some of Paul's richest, most profound teaching. Okay? And by the way, I'm not suggesting it's easy. But there are some challenging things here, some things that completely refute the traditional view of Adam, sin, and death. And one of those things is, as Paul in Romans chapter 5, 14 through the end of the chapter really, contrasts Adam, sin, and death and Christ, righteousness, and life. Now, here's the question that I want to pose to you. We've touched upon it already, but I must drive this home. If the death that came through Adam was biological death, you sin, you die physically. If that's the case, then it should be of necessity the case that if Christ is the solution to that, then acceptance of the free gift of Christ, of grace, and mercy, and righteousness, and forgiveness, should mean no more death. Because in Paul's theology in Romans chapter 5, 14 and following, there is a direct one-to-one relationship. Adam, sin, death, Christ, righteousness, and life. So if the death in Adam, sin, and death was biological death, then of necessity, the life in the Christ, righteousness, and life equation must be biological life. If not, why not? Now notice, Romans 5:14 again, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one who is about to come. Now watch this. The free gift is not like the offense, for if by the one man, or one man's offense, many, or the many died, much more the grace of God, and the gift by the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, abounded to many. Do you see what he's saying? As in Adam, all men die. Okay, if that's biological death, as in Adam all men die, even so in Christ shall all men be made alive. But how many died in Adam? All of those who sinned. How many would be alive in Christ? The key there is in Christ. And we'll undoubtedly talk about that later because, you know, some people, I tell you, some people accuse covenant eschatology of teaching universalism. And I got to tell you what, folks, people who have no contact with covenant eschatology whatsoever, down through the centuries, have gone to Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians 15:22 and come to the conclusion that Paul was a universalist. Well, I want to tell you what, folks, if you don't deal with the problem of Adam and the glory of Christ within the framework of in Adam, and more specifically and more powerfully in Christ, then, I don't care if you're a panmillennialist. That is, everything will pan out in the wash. I don't care if you're a panmillennialist. You have to deal with that. To ignore Paul's defining, restricting in Christ, which is where the counterpart of in Adam is to be found. It is where the life is to be found. Then you've got to deal with that problem. That's not a problem for covenant eschatology believers. We accept Paul's definition of in Christ is where all salvation is to be found. We accept and teach and preach that it is in Christ, which means not out of Christ. In Christ are men made alive. That's what we believe. Well, anyway, here's what you have to catch in our discussion of Adam, life, and death. Adam, sin, and death. And Christ, righteousness, and life. If it is the case that the death that entered when Adam sinned is biological life, and if it is the case that the life in Christ is the counterpart and the cure for the death that was in Adam, then it must be the case, that biological life is the life that is to be found in Christ. Therefore, those in Christ should never die biologically, because they have escaped the death of Adam, which had come upon them when they sinned. Do you catch the power of that? Let me reiterate here. This is so critical. Romans 5:14 and following presents a one-to-one contrast. Adam, sin and death, Christ, righteousness and life. If therefore the death of Adam, the death that entered through Adam, was biological life, then of necessity the life that came through Christ was and is biological life, and no Christian should ever die. Paul is not talking about a different Adam, a different sin, and a different death in Romans 5 from what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's the same death. And the life in Christ is the direct cure and the direct counterpart of that. So one more time, if the death that entered through Adam was biological life, then it must be true that the life that is in Christ is biological life, and the child of God should never die physically. Okay, we're going to go into chapter 6 now of Romans as we continue our discussion of Adam's sin and death and Christ, righteousness and life. We will see you on the flip side.